Hi, my name is Fisher Solis, and my group will be going over Chapter 2 of How Progress Ends. When people think about why some countries became rich and industrialized while others fell behind, they usually go to simple answers first, like culture, geography, or whether people were just more hardworking there. But Chapter 2 of How Progress Ends focuses on China's reversal of fortune, argues that the story is a lot more complicated than that. This chapter is not saying China lacked innovation. Actually, one of Frey's main points is the opposite. China was one of the most advanced civilizations in the world for a long time, with major technological advancements long before industrialization really took off in Europe. So the real question here is not why was China underdeveloped. The real question is, why didn't a society with such strong early advantages keep that progression going into long-term industrial growth the way parts of Europe eventually did? The core idea of this chapter is that progress is not just about inventions or talented people. Those things matter, but Frey is pushing us to look at something bigger. The way a system is set up matters, institutions matter, and incentives matter, and political structure matters too. China's centralized state created real strengths early on, those like coordination, administrative control, and the ability to spread systems across a very large empire. But over time, that same structure also came off with trade-offs. The same institutions that helped maintain order and scale could also make independent experimentation harder, push talented people toward bureaucracy, and make progress more dependent on what helped preserve political stability. So instead of asking broad questions like why did Europe win or why did China fall behind, this chapter is basically pushing us to ask better questions such as what kind of system rewards innovation instead of conformity? How do institutions shape where talented people put their time and effort? When does state power help progress, and when can it start slowing down? And how do political incentives affect whether a society keeps experimenting or starts choosing stability over change? Those questions help explain why progress can grow for a long time, but also why it can slow us down, weaken, or even reverse. To make that clear, the chapter keeps coming back to a few big ideas that we're going to use throughout this podcast. First, institutions and incentives. The chapter shows that progress depends a lot on how a society is organized and what kinds of behavior its institutions reward. If the strongest rewards go toward administration, control, or protecting the status quo, then innovation gets harder to sustain. Second, state capacity and coordination. Strong centralized systems can create major advantages, especially early on, by building infrastructure, standardizing systems, and spreading ideas across a large population. Third are political trade-offs. The same structures that create stability and order can also make experimentation more difficult, especially when leaders become more focused on control or internal stability than long-term innovation. And fourth, long-term development is not automatic. A society can be highly advanced in one era and still lose momentum later if the system supporting continued progress starts to weaken or change. So the biggest message of this chapter is not that China failed because it lacked ability, and it's also not that progress always moves in a straight line. The message is that long-term progress depends on the systems that shape incentives, direct talent, and determine whether innovation keeps being supported over time. That's why this chapter matters beyond just Chinese history. It gives us a broader way to think about development, not as something guaranteed, but as something that depends on political and institutional conditions that can either support progress or slowly weaken it. In the next parts of this podcast, we'll break down the key mechanisms behind Frey's argument, walk through a worked example and what it shows, address a common misconception about China's reversal of fortune, and then close off with the most important takeaways of Chapter 2.
So today I want to take a deeper look at Chapter 2 of Carl Benedict Frey's How Progress Ends, a chapter that lays out how underlying mechanism that causes society to slow down, resist innovation, or even reverse progress altogether. Frey's central point is that stagnation doesn't just happen. It emerges from predictable forces that we can observe across history and that we can see shaping our world right now. Chapter 2 is especially important because it moves beyond simple explanations like technology slowed down or people stopped inventing things. Instead, Frey shows that progress is shaped by political choices, economic structures, and social reactions. And when those forces turn inwards or defensive, progress can grind to a halt. Let me walk you through three of the major mechanisms Frey uses in the chapter, three mechanisms that really stand out. The first mechanism is political backlash against disruption. The first mechanism Frey highlights is political backlash, the way societies respond when technological change threatens people's jobs, identities, or sense of stability. Frey notes that periods of rapid technological change have always been accompanied by political turbulence. That line captures the heart of the problem. Innovation doesn't just create new opportunities, it also creates new anxieties. Throughout history, whenever new technologies reshaped the economy, people pushed back. The Ludides destroyed textile machines, farmers resisted early tractors. Even in the 20th century, automation sparked waves of political anger in industrial regions. Frey's point is not that people are irrational, it's that when individuals feel economically insecure, they naturally demand protection, and politicians, especially those who rely on broad public support, often respond by showing or blocking the very innovations that could drive long-term growth. This mechanism matters because it shows how progress can be derailed not by a lack of ideas, but by the political consequences of those ideas. When fear outweighs optimism, societies choose safety over experimentation. Mechanism 2. The second mechanism Frey emphasizes in the concentration of economic power, especially in industries dominated by few large firms. Frey writes that incumbents frequently deploy their influence to shape markets in a way that preserve their dominance. In other words, the companies with the most resources often have the strongest incentives to prevent disruptive innovation. This mechanism is subtle but incredibly important. When markets become dominated by a handful of powerful players, innovation shows that not because people stop inventing, but because the gatekeepers don't want competition. They buy up smaller firms, lobby or regulations that favor them, or simply refuse to adopt technologies that might undermine their existing business models. Frey uses this mechanism to explain why some societies appear technologically advanced but are actually stagnant beneath the surface. If the firms that control the economy are more invested in protecting their position than in pushing boundaries, progress becomes shallow and uneven. This mechanism also helps explain why some countries fall behind even when they have talented workers and strong educational systems. Innovation requires not just ideas, but the freedom for new ideas to challenge the old ones. The third mechanism Frey highlights in the erosion of public trust in its institutions, governments, scientific bodies, universities, and even the idea of expertise itself. Frey argues that when trust declines, societies become less willing to invest in long-term projects like research, infrastructure, and education. This mechanism is especially dangerous because it creates a feedback loop. When people distrust institutions, they oppose funding for innovation. When innovation slows, institutions look less effective, and when institutions look less effective, trust declines even further. Frey's point is that progress depends on collective confidence that investments will pay off, that experts know why they're doing, and society as a whole will benefit without the trust that even the best ideas struggle to gain support. These mechanisms interact. One of these strengths of the two is that Frey doesn't threaten these mechanisms as isolated. He shows that they reinforce one another. Political backlash can strengthen incumbents who promise stability. Powerful incumbents can shape public opinion and weaken trust in the institutions that challenge. Declining trust can fuel more backlash, which leads to more protectionism, which leads to more stagnation. It's a cycle, one that has been repeated through history. Today I want to explain the institutional rigidity mechanism from Carl Benedict Frey's How Progress Ends and show how it connects to the economic image in front of us. Frey argues that progress isn't slow because technology stops advancing, it slows when institution fails to adapt. To new economic realities, institutions like governments, regulatory systems, and labor markets become rigid. They hold on to old rules, old cost structures, and old expectations, even when the world around them is changing. As Frey puts it, institutions that once enabled progress can become barriers when they fail to adjust to new realities. The image you see illustrates exactly how this rigidity plays out in the economy. It shows how a leftward shift in the short run aggregate supply curve caused by rising production costs in the case: higher health insurance premiums paid by firms when institutions don't update policies or cost structures to match modern conditions. Business faces increased burdens. Those rising costs reduce the amount of goods and service firms can supply at every price level. This institution rigidity in action has cost price. Institutions that don't adapt, firms become less productive. The economy produces less at a higher price level. In the graph, that outcome is shown by the movement from SRAS to SRAS squared, leading to the higher prices and lower output. Price point and these rigidity accumulate over time. These create an environment where innovation slows, investment weakens, and society falls behind more flexible competitors.
Alright, so looking at this chapter 2, which is about China's reversal of fortune, it's very easy for us to look at the simple explanations. But one of the common misconceptions of this topic is the idea that China fell behind because it lacked in ways such as creativity, intelligence, or its technological ability. But this chapter, which is chapter 2, tends to talk about things that actually oppose this narrative. And now, historically, China was one of the most technologically advanced civilizations on Earth. It always came up with major inventions like the compass, detailed techniques of printing, and complex mechanical devices years and years before similar things showed up in Europe and the West. And for much of the history, China actually wasn't lagging, but it was leading the charge. So the problem is not why China was moving backward, but why a society that had once been so innovative did not transition into continuous industrial growth. Now, a frequent misconception is that China's decline can purely be explained by the superiority of the West and perhaps Europe. But while Europe's industrialization was very, very important, the chapter kind of highlights China's trajectory, how its trajectory cannot be singled out to outside forces alone. China's internal political and institutional structures played a huge part in its regression. In other words, China's experience is not simply a story of being overtaken, but also a story of how domestic systems shaped long-run innovation. Now, a third misunderstanding involves the relationship between state centralization and progress. It is easy to assume that a strong centralized state is either always good or bad for the development of a certain country. But the chapter presents more of a distinct view. It talks about how China's centralized bureaucracy initially produced massive advantages and gains, and how things like standardized writing systems, extensive infrastructure, unified measurements, and coordinated large-scale projects helped China's technologies and ideas rapidly spread across its vast empire. These features supported political growth, agricultural productivity, and commercial integration. But over time, the same centralized system generated trade-offs. Political stability and administrative control came at the expense of diversity and thought, and decentralized this experimentation. The state then became very effective at scaling its innovations, yet less conducive and to disruptive paradigm shifting change. Now, this helps correct the simplistic belief that centralization automatically guarantees this long-term progress. And now, another misconception concerns the famous hydraulic society theory. The idea that China centralized because irrigation required it. The chapter notes significant problems with this argument. Bureaucratic development began in regions dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and many societies historically have been able to manage irrigation without extreme political centralization. So while the infrastructure and the coordination of it all mattered, they did not fully explain China's distinctive political path. Perhaps the most important misconception involves incentives. We often imagine that technological progress naturally emerges wherever the talent exists. But this chapter kind of talked about and showed that talent flows depends heavily on its rewards, institutional rewards. China's civil service examination created extraordinary incentives for these ambitious individuals. Success meant prestige, wealth, and legal privileges. As a result, generations of very highly capable people rationally directed their efforts towards mastering Confucian texts and securing bureaucratic office rather than pursuing scientific experimentation or commercial innovation. This doesn't imply that Chinese society lacked these capable thinkers, but instead it illustrated how the incentives shaped all of their capital and human capital. I mean, a system designed to promote administrative success that is just kind of mediocre also concentrated the ambition within the government roles, which may have limited the emergence of independent scientific communities and experimentation in entrepreneurship. Now, stepping back from these common misconceptions, let's talk about some key takeaways. First, technological leadership at one point in history does not guarantee that China's early advantages were real and substantial, yet long-run progress depends not only on a diffusion of ideas, but also the types of ideas a society tends to encourage and reward. Second state capacity involves these complex trade-offs, and strong centralized systems can enable this coordination, large-scale projects, and rapid dissemination of knowledge. At the same time, excessive concentration of authority may reduce the diversity of the intellectuals. It could constrain experimentation and narrow these incentives for unconventional innovation. Progress is not just about state strength, but about how political structures interact with its creativity. Third, incentives matter enormously. This chapter emphasized the institutional rewards influence what talented individuals chose to do. When the highest returns come from bureaucratic success rather than scientific discovery or entrepreneurial risks and risk thinking, the entire direction of this innovation can shift. Basically, people are choosing financial success over these scientific discoveries. And now moving on to the fourth thing, political stability can sometimes work against transformative change. Systems that successfully maintain order may reduce pressures from experimentation, reform, or technological disruption, particularly when these rulers perceive internal threats as more urgent than the external competition that was maybe happening in the West or in Europe. Finally, China's experience reminds us that economic and technological paths and trajectories are deeply shaped by politics, information systems, and the government. The story is not one of cultural deviancy or inevitable decline, but of how institutions, elite incentives, and monitoring challenges influence this long-term development. Understanding these dynamics has helped us move beyond simplistic explanations and appreciate how progress can be so fragile and highly dependent on these underlying structures. Thank you.